Kate Libby, the Director of Education and the Associate Curator here at the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum, and I'd like to welcome you back to the second part of our tour of the small boat shed here at the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum as part of Chesapeake Treasure, a feature here on Facebook where we explore one of the 68,000 objects in our collections. And this week we're really going to continue to focus on some of the amazing idiosyncratic and one-of-a-kind vessels here in our small boat shed collection at the Maritime Museum. Although many of you who have visited have seen a lot of the vessels in our collection, the larger boats floating, and that's a big part of what makes us distinctive here at the Maritime Museum, we do have an extensive collection of small craft that while they no longer float on the water, they still can tell us a lot about how people have interacted with the Chesapeake Bay. Now, we did last week lose a lot of the audio in the beginning to the wind, and I just wanted to give you a quick introduction to the building that we're in today, the small boat shed. So, visitors to the Maritime Museum might be under the impression that when they arrive on campus, boy, it's all so historic looking, it must have always been like that. And while that means that we're doing our job right, the small boat shed is really one of the few historic buildings on our campus. It was moved here in 1933 from Claiborne, Maryland, where it was the freight and steamboat depot. So the steamboat would come alongside the dock and trains could come into this building. Now, it was when the trains went out of business, this building was no longer used for anything, and so a cannery here in St. Michael's decided that they would like the building, and they were looking to economize, because of course it's 1933, it's during the Depression. So they take it apart piece by piece, and they put it back together in a new configuration here in St. Michael's, minus the big sort of clear story section that had been on the roof before. So it's been here ever since, and it is the only building on our campus today that reflects that industrial story that is so much a part of Chesapeake heritage and St. Michael's history as well. So let's jump into this tour. Many of you might know that I wrote a book on oysters, and that means I can't help but love any boat that tells a story about the oystering industry. And this is one of those vessels. This is a Yankees Gift built in Staten Island. And you might be thinking, why would you have a vessel built in Staten Island here in the collections of the Maritime Museum? Well, it tells a very Chesapeake story about the beginning of the oystering industry. So vessels like this, there was actually a cross-state trade in oysters in the 19th century. You would actually see vessels coming down from New York, where there was a huge demand for oysters, down to the Chesapeake, where really the industry hadn't taken hold yet, especially in the early part of the 19th century. And these vessels from New York would load up with oysters, and then they'd head back to New York to supply the market. Now, on their way down, they would bring skiffs on the decks of these larger schooners and other vessels that were coming down to harvest oysters and transport them back to New York. And they would have these skiffs on board to allow them, when they reached Virginia, to tong for oysters, these Yankee skiffs. So this is a great example of that type of vessel. I love it because you've got some of the classic tools of oystering on board. You've got these tongs here on the deck that would allow you to reach down into the water and pick oysters up off the bottom. You've got a culling board here, which is where you'd put the oysters once you pulled them up, and you'd sort through them, you know, the ones that were too small, the ones that were bigger. You also see the classic colors that were typical of vessels in the Chesapeake in the 19th century, that sort of minty green, that rich red, and that clear white. And again, you know, that's one of the things that you can learn from visiting the Maritime Museum, is that you know, people painted boats in different colors in the past, and so, you know, historically speaking, you would have had a very different aesthetic experience seeing these boats out on the water. Now, I also like the fact that you can tell you've got oarlocks here, that this is a rowboat. So this is unlike other vessels that were used for oystering. This is not a sailboat. This never had an engine. This is specifically one used for rowing, and these tongs would have helped to harvest the oysters, get them back to these boats that were going to New York. And so vessels like these Yankees Gifts, and of course the name implies that, you know, these are northern built boats. These Yankees Gifts kind of hung around in Virginia for a long time. So I love this boat because I think it clearly tells us the story about, you know, the Chesapeake's influences in terms of its watercraft is so much bigger than just the Chesapeake Bay. All right, so let's go down. We're going to walk and take a quick look at two vessels that we actually had one of our commenters say they'd love to see me talk about the Bessie Lee, so I'd be happy to. And in fact, I'd love to compare the Bessie Lee with another skiff that we have in our collection, the Lorraine. So follow me. So here I am between two vessels, the Bessie Lee on my right and then the Lorraine on my left. Now, these two vessels don't look alike, but they actually did a lot of the same type of work. In the summertime, they were used for recreation, and in the wintertime and spring, they were used for harvesting fish. So on my right is the Bessie Lee, which is a seaside bateau. Now, bateau, a French word for boat, is something you actually hear rather commonly in the Chesapeake used to describe these small watercraft. I grew up on the Chester River, and that's a place where you often hear people referring to skiffs as bateau. So Bessie Lee is a seaside bateau, which means that she was used on the ocean side, not the bay side, for going out for harvesting oysters. And if you haven't been to some of the coves around Chesapeake, there's tons of oysters in that area. She would have been used for fishing, and as you can see, she was a sailboat. Now, but bateau of this type were very easy to sail, very stable. You can see she's very beamy. She really provides a very stable platform for people when they go out and for when they sail. So that's what made her also a really good recreational boat. She's easy to sail. You can unstep the mast with just a few people. We have photographs of her being sailed by just 2 people. So Bessie Lee was used for both. And not only that, you can see, of course, she's got oarlocks here too, so that you could row her out. She was very versatile. And that's what people wanted. You know, if they were going to, maybe she'd do a little oystering in the wintertime, but as people started to go to the ocean to vacation in the early 20th century, she would have been a great vessel to use just to go out and have fun in. Now, the Lorraine tells a similar story. And this one, this vessel I love because, I mean, unlike the Bessie Lee, who is, you know, really appealing and cute, the Lorraine is much bigger, much stabler. She tells the story of a really different part of the Chesapeake Bay. All the way up in Betterton, which is near the Sassafras, really very, very far north on the Chesapeake, you've got these 2 resort communities, Tolchester Beach and Betterton. Tolchester was a day trip. It's a place that you leave Baltimore, you visit for the day. Betterton was a place you'd stay longer term. Now, Tolchester just closed down in the winter. Betterton remained what it was originally, which is a fishing community. So the Lorraine is an example of a vessel that would have been used for fishing and for gill netting, especially for shad in the spring and for harvesting oysters and other species in the wintertime. But then in the summertime, she became a recreational boat. So she would have been full of pleasure boaters, people you know, in big starched lawn hats and white dresses and bow ties with celluloid collars going out to enjoy a day. And again, a very stable, wide, comfortable, commodious boat. And she's a good example of one that, like the Bessie Lee, would have been rowed, but she does not have a place for a mast. So this was not a sailboat. This was just a vessel that would have gotten along with rowing, which is probably for the best, considering that a lot of people who were vacationing in Betterton were definitely not experienced mariners. So that's sort of some of the 20th century vessels that we have in this part of the small boat shed. And we have one more boat that I'd like to talk to you about today as our tour of the small boat shed for Chesapeake Treasure. So let's do one more. So I'm standing here in front of a crab skiff. Now, those of you who joined us last week know that I talked a little bit about a crab skiff that we have in our collection that's on the other side of the small boat shed that originally had an engine. The man who used it actually had it taken out because he used it around Smith Island where he could just prong it through the water harvesting crabs. And this boat was built on Hooper's Island, and like that other vessel, it was also a crabbing skiff. But you can see that we've got a few differences here. We've got a set of bull's horns, and we've got, this boat is set up for crabbing. This is for crabbing with a trot line. Unlike the other vessel that we saw before, where that person would have just been using a dip net to dip up crabs from the bottom of the bay, this used a very different tool. And I grew up trot lining on the Chester River, and it's just as much fun, and it's as, you know, crabbing might be just using a dip net, but you catch a lot more crabs at once. And you can see these bull's horns are, you know, that would have had a line that went over them that was baited. But again, this is a boat that's really built for very shallow water, very narrow tributaries, little coves and marshes and guts. And one of the things I really love about this, and it just goes to show, again, Chesapeake Bay craft are so idiosyncratic, and people who live here are willing to adapt to any opportunities they see, is if you look inside, you can see we've got a little engine here, and attached to it is something that those of you who have been in the military might recognize. This is the gas tank that was also used, it's ammunition, you know, that would have washed down from Bloodworth Island where they were doing all the testing. And I love that, you know, this washed up, and the waterman who saw it on Hooper's Island thought, well, I need a gas tank, here's a canister, I'm gonna make this work. So it's kind of weird, but also really fantastic in terms of telling the story about how Chesapeake Bay boats are a reflection of the environment. They're tools that are built for, to reflect the needs of the people that are using them. And they have so much to tell us about how people have related to the Chesapeake Bay over time and adapted to their environment and their needs. So those are just a few of the boats that we have in our small boat shed here at the Maritime Museum. I hope you've learned more about how cool they are and why you should, if you have the opportunity, come visit and take a closer look yourself, perhaps this winter or this spring. So thanks so much. Join us again next week for some cool objects here on Chesapeake Treasure. Thanks, and have a great afternoon.